The Persei Rift was burning. From the viewport of Argus Prime's training facility, the nebula looked like a fractured wound across the stars, streaked with fire and shadow. Civilian haulers, slow, lumbering ships never meant for combat, were scattering like frightened cattle, their distress signals overlapping into a single desperate wail. Over 200,000 lives were crammed inside those metal hulks, and every one of them was about to be carved apart by the Xenogen raiders closing in with predator patience. Inside the control deck, cadets and officers froze in silence. Protocol said the cadets stayed grounded. Protocol said the 8th Fleet was 6 hours out. Protocol said the civilians were already dead. Evelyn Cross wasn't built for protocol. She leaned closer to her console, pulse hammering in her throat. The tactical display painted a picture she couldn't unsee, red enemy markers weaving between blue civilian dots, the distance shrinking second by second. Every part of her training screamed to wait, to hold, to let the real soldiers handle it. But her gut, the instinct that had never failed her, whispered that 6 hours was too long. By then, there'd be nothing left to save. "This is Cadet Evelyn Cross requesting immediate launch clearance," she said into the comm. Her voice was steady, sharper than she felt. The control officer barked back almost instantly, panic buried beneath layers of authority. "Negative, Cadet. All training craft are grounded until—" "I wasn't asking for permission." Around her, heads snapped in disbelief. Evelyn was already moving, her hands flying across the interface as if she'd rehearsed this 100 times. The hangar doors groaned, unlocking with an authority that should have been impossible. She'd broken into the system weeks ago, memorizing every override code while her instructors called it paranoia. On the flight deck, the SF-9 training craft hummed to life. It was hardly more than a flying can with thrusters. No shields, no heavy weapons, armor so thin a micrometeor could shred it. But it was a ship, and right now it was the only ship that mattered. The hangar bay lit up in warning reds. Technicians shouted, a klaxon blared, and Commander Ralvek's gravelly voice cut through the comms. "Cross, stand down immediately. That's a direct order." Evelyn slid into the pilot's seat, her palms slick against the worn controls. She pressed her helmet into place, exhaled once, and let the world fall quiet. "Copy that, Control," she said, a thin smile tugging at her lips. "Standing down in approximately 30 minutes. The engines roared, and the SF-9 shot from the hangar like a bullet loose from a god's revolver. The stars blurred, the nebula flared, and in a single heartbeat, Evelyn was in the middle of hell. The Xenogen warships loomed ahead, vast, cathedral-like, constructs bristling with weapons, their beams slicing through fleeing transports as if they were paper. Evelyn's craft shook violently as she dove between two lances of plasma fire, alarms howling in protest. The G-forces clawed at her body, blackness creeping at the edges of her vision. The inertial dampeners weren't built for this. She wasn't built for this. "What the hell is she doing?" A voice cracked over the open channel. "She's getting herself killed," another snapped. Evelyn barely heard them. Her mind was focused, locked into numbers she'd been running for months, theories she'd been laughed at for even whispering. Stellar slip. A trick of resonance. A way of syncing a ship's quantum frequency with the gravity tide of a star field. In theory, it could erase momentum for a breath, make inertia vanish like smoke. In theory, it was madness. But theory was all she had. Her cockpit vibrated like it was about to come apart. Warning panels strobed across her vision. Structural integrity. Failing. G-force exceeding human threshold. Abort, abort, abort. Evelyn gritted her teeth. "Not today." She keyed the sequence she'd memorized in the quiet of sleepless nights. Numbers flowed like prayer, the frequency of the rift's gravitational. Drift, the oscillation of her ship's resonance, the exact nanosecond where both would align. Her heart slammed in her chest, matching the rhythm, syncing with the universe itself. And then, the universe blinked. The crushing pressure vanished. The screaming alarms cut out. For 3 impossible seconds, the ship was weightless in every sense, untethered by inertia, gliding through fire like a ghost. Beams of energy carved empty air where she had been, the Xenogen targeting systems sputtering as if they'd lost track of her existence entirely. On the control deck, silence fell. She just slipped. No way. That's impossible. But Evelyn Cross was already past impossible. Her SF-9 slid out of the stellar slip just behind the nearest Xenogen dreadnought, her trajectory so precise it felt like the stars themselves had bent to her will. For the first time since the civilians began to flee, the battlefield tipped, and Evelyn, breathless and shaking but alive, realized she had just broken the laws of physics and every rule in the book to save them. The Persei rift was still burning, but the war had just changed forever. Under the cold lights of Argus Prime's tribunal chamber, Evelyn Cross stood at attention, her uniform still scorched from the rift. The vast room was built to intimidate, columns of black alloy rising into shadows, banners of the interstellar, Defense Council hanging like judgmental eyes. Every cadet, officer, and dignitary in attendance knew the outcome before a single word was spoken. Evelyn wasn't here to be honored. She was here to be buried. "Cadet Cross!" Admiral Sarath's voice boomed, deep and resonant, carrying the weight of tradition older than Earth's first colony ship. He was tall for his species, pale-skinned with a lattice of ridges across his forehead that made his every frown seem carved in stone. "You stand accused of 19 separate violations of protocol, including theft of military property, disobedience of direct orders, and reckless endangerment of civilian populations." Evelyn kept her chin up, though her stomach twisted. "Endangerment of civilians?" "I saved them." She forced her voice to stay level. "With respect, sir, those civilians are alive because I acted." A ripple of murmurs surged through the chamber. Some faces in the crowd looked at her with awe, others glared with contempt. "That is not the point!" Sarath snapped, slamming his datapad onto the podium. "You undermined the chain of command. You disobeyed direct orders. If every cadet acted on their own judgment, this council would descend into chaos." From the gallery, Commander Ralvek shifted, his arms crossed, his reptilian eyes narrowing. Evelyn caught his gaze for a fraction of a second. He'd been the one shouting for her to stand down. Now he said nothing. Inside, Evelyn felt heat rise. She wanted to scream that protocol had nearly condemned 70,000 families to slaughter, that rules meant nothing if they cost lives. But she had already learned that shouting at stone only bloodied your fists. "I acted because no one else would," she said instead. Her voice was low, steady, defiant. Sarath's ridges deepened into something like disgust. "Cadet Cross, you are hereby stripped of commendations and denied promotion eligibility. Effective immediately, you are reassigned to Polaris 7 Outpost. The A." Words felt like a sentence to exile. A low murmur swept the chamber, this time sharper, carrying an edge of unease. Polaris 7 was a graveyard for careers, an icebound station on the galactic rim where no one of consequence was ever heard from again. Mini hooks sparked when Evelyn caught the whispers of two officers behind her. "Polaris 7? That place isn't for punishment. It's for containment." "Containment of what?" They fell silent as Sarath raised his hand. "Dismissed." Evelyn saluted crisply, though her hand trembled. As she turned to leave, fragments of hushed voices trailed her steps. Dangerous precedent. If she inspires others? Already rumors of what she did at the rift. A mini twist slipped into her gut like ice. They weren't afraid of her failure. They were afraid of her success. Outside the tribunal hall, the corridors of Argus Prime were suffocatingly bright, every polished surface reflecting her isolation. She walked alone, the echo of her boots loud in the emptiness. Cadets who had once shared drinks with her now looked away. A few dared glances, half envy, half fear, as though proximity to her might draw the council's wrath. She reached the docking bay, her duffel in hand, and boarded the shuttle bound for Polaris 7. The pilot, a scarred veteran with tired eyes, glanced back as she strapped in. "Guess you're the famous Cross," he muttered. Evelyn arched an eyebrow. "Famous or infamous?" The pilot's mouth twisted into something not quite a smile. "Depends who's telling the story. Some say you're a traitor. Others say you bent the stars." The shuttle thrummed as it lifted from the bay, slipping free of Argus Prime's gravity well. Evelyn pressed her forehead to the viewport. Stars streaked past in cold silence. Her chest tightened with something heavier, then fear. Not regret, never regret, but a gnawing certainty that this wasn't over. Her hands itched for the controls again, for the impossible calculations that had saved lives. And deep in her bones, she knew the tribunal hadn't exiled her to Polaris 7. To silence her. They'd sent her there because they didn't know how else to contain what she'd started. For the first time since the rift, Evelyn smiled. Sharp, unyielding, dangerous. Let them bury her at the edge of nowhere. The galaxy had already seen what she could do. And somewhere out there she was sure others were already trying to follow. The shuttle dropped out of FTL with a bone-jarring lurch, stars snapping back into sharp points. Through the viewport, Polaris 7 filled the frame, a derelict sentinel of steel and ice orbiting a dying blue star. The station looked less like a military outpost and more like a forgotten relic. Its plating scarred. Its antenna arrays bent like broken bones. Frost crawled along its surface, and entire sections sat in shadow, as if the place had simply given up on light. "Welcome to paradise," the pilot muttered, throttling back as docking clamps extended from the station. "Try not to die of boredom." Evelyn unstrapped slowly, her duffel slung over one shoulder. The airlock hissed open, releasing a gust of recycled air tinged with cold metal. Stepping through, she immediately felt the silence, a silence that wasn't peaceful but watchful, heavy, as though every corridor had eyes. At the docking bay, a figure was waiting. Commander Ralvek stood stiff and unyielding, his scaled skin reflecting the pale glow of overhead lights. He looked carved from stone, every line of his posture radiating authority. "Cadet Cross," he said, his voice flat. "I am your new commanding officer." Evelyn tilted her head, her smirk faint but deliberate. "Guess I'm not dead yet, Commander." His jaw tightened. "Your quarters are in Section C. You report to maintenance at 0800. Do not confuse this station for a battlefield." "Here, you are a mechanic." She snapped a mock salute. "Yes, sir. I'll try to keep my wrench aimed in the right direction." His eyes narrowed, but he turned without another word, his boots striking the deck in precise rhythm. Evelyn followed, the map overlay blinking in her wristband, her path winding through gray corridors dimly lit by flickering panels. Her quarters were barely a closet, one bunk, one locker, one viewport staring into endless darkness. Tossing her duffel down, Evelyn sat on the bunk, exhaling. The silence pressed in again, except this time she felt it wasn't just the station humming, it was people, watching, judging, waiting. The door chimed. Evelyn frowned. "Enter." A towering figure stepped in. He was Nisari, four-eyed and scarred, his mandibles twitching with every word. The scars weren't random, they were patterned, deliberate, battle marks etched into his flesh like history written on skin. "I am Captain Zareth," he said, his voice a gravel storm. "I wish to meet the human who defied physics." Evelyn blinked, caught off guard. "You've heard of the rift. We have all studied it, many times." His eyes locked on hers, uncomfortably intense. "The mathematics does not work. They should not work." Her throat tightened. "And yet, here I am." Zareth's mandibles clicked in what might have been a smile or a warning. 17 pilots have attempted your maneuver. 12 are still in medical school. 2 are missing. The others," his voice dropped, "refused to speak of what they experienced." Evelyn's stomach turned cold. She had thought the stellar slip was hers alone, a wild gamble no one would dare repeat. But they had. Others had tried, others had bled for it. Before she could answer, the station shuddered with an alarm. A measured voice spoke over the intercom in multiple languages. "All combat personnel to ready stations, code yellow, sector 7. Zareth's eyes flared. "Come, you will want to see this." They strode together to the command center, a cavernous chamber alive with screens and tension. Displays lit up with images of a civilian convoy under attack, pirate ships circling like wolves. Commander Ralvek's voice cut through the chatter. "Alpha Squadron, launch and contain, standard protocol." 4 fighters detached from the Shiori station, vectoring toward the ambush. Evelyn studied the tactical readout, her chest tightening. It was textbook defense, clean, precise, and utterly useless. The pirates would be gone in 12 minutes. Alpha Squadron needed 18 to reach the convoy. Her fists clenched. she heard herself say almost against her will. "They'll never make it in time." Ralvek's eyes didn't leave the display. "Your maintenance now, Cross. Maintain silence." Evelyn bit her tongue. Her heart hammered as she stared at the convoy's desperate scatter, at the pirates boxing them in. Those weren't dots on a screen. They were people, families, kids. Her body moved before her brain caught up. She bolted from the command center, boots pounding down steel corridors, her pulse roaring in her ears. The hangar bay was 2 levels below. She knew exactly where they kept the emergency fighters, and she knew the access codes. Nobody expected a cadet to break the rules twice. Inside the hangar, the SF-12 gleamed under cold light. Newer than her old SF-9, sleeker, meaner, but still not meant for miracles. Evelyn slammed into the cockpit, fingers flying across controls. The intercom crackled with Ralvek's voice, furious. "Cross! Return to quarters immediately! That's an order!" Evelyn grinned through the adrenaline flooding her veins. "Sorry, Commander. I think you're breaking up." The engines roared. The SF-12 blasted into space, its nose pointed straight at the chaos unfolding in Sector 7. And as the stars streaked toward her, Evelyn Cross felt it again. The numbers whispering, the pulse aligning, the impossible waiting just beyond the edge of reason. This wasn't over, not even close. The void erupted in chaos as Evelyn's SF-12 tore across Sector 7. Ahead, the convoy's bulky freighters scattered like frightened prey, their engines screaming but too slow to escape. Pirate vessels encircled them in disciplined arcs. Their formation loose enough to evade concentrated fire, yet tight enough to corner their victims. It wasn't random. It was a trap honed by experience. Alpha Squadron had finally reached the edge of engagement range. 4 sleek fighters moving by the book, cutting across at the standard intercept vector. Evelyn's gut twisted. The pirates would snap shut like jaws the moment Alpha came close. Her comms lit up with Ralvek's icy fury. "Cross, turn back now! This is your final warning!" She flicked the switch and killed the channel. Silence was better than chains. Her HUD flashed, scarlet as pirate weapons locked onto her. Dozens of targeting brackets closed in, her SF-12 shrieking alarms. Yeah, I see it," she muttered, fingers flying across the console. The ship wasn't built for this kind of insanity, but she was. Evelyn inhaled deep, centering herself. The numbers began to flow again. Not from screens, but from memory, from instinct. Frequencies, oscillations, gravitational drift. The stars pulsed like a heartbeat, and hers began to match. And then another voice cracked across a private channel. Deep, gravelly, unmistakable. "This is Zareth. You will not fly alone." Evelyn's head jerked up. 3 more signatures flared onto her display, slicing from Polaris 7's shadow. Zareth's heavily modified Nisari interceptor, Marcus Hale's patched-together fighter with half its panels scorched black, and a 3rd vessel cobbled together from parts that looked like they'd been stolen from a scrapyard. Evelyn's lips curved into a grin. "I didn't ask for backup." Zareth rumbled back. "You didn't have to." The 4 of them dove as one, cutting across the stars like falling blades. Pirate ships scrambled, their neat formation unraveling as the hunters realized they had become prey. Evelyn felt the slip building again, her pulse sinking, her body screaming against G-force. Her SF-12 flickered out of momentum like a ghost, sliding through a crossfire that should have shredded her to atoms. She reappeared inside the pirates' defensive perimeter, unleashing a burst of laser fire that gutted their lead craft. The wreck spun, trailing plasma. Zareth came in hard from above, his modified cannons spitting arcs of energy that shouldn't have been possible for a single ship. The engineer, Marcus, was everywhere at once, his fighter blinking across vectors with chaotic precision, leaving enemies firing at ghosts. The scrapyard vessel moved stubbornly, soaking hits and returning fire with brutal accuracy. The pirates panicked. Their formation collapsed into chaos. Evelyn's console screamed with warnings. She'd pushed the slip too far this time. The resonance tore at her ship's frame, the hull groaning like it was about to rip apart. Her vision tunneled as blood pounded in her skull, darkness nibbling at the edges of sight. Her hand shook, her breath ragged. For one terrifying second, she felt herself slipping. Not just the ship, but her body, her mind. Everything unraveling. Into the void. Breathe. Sink. Trust it. Her heartbeat steadied. The ship steadied. The slip snapped into place like a lock finding its key. She exploded from the drift behind a pirate frigate, close enough to scrape its hull. One precise lance of energy, and the frigate ruptured into fire. 90 seconds. That was all it took. 90 seconds for 4 renegade ships to dismantle a pirate ambush that should have claimed thousands of lives. The convoy's desperate comms went from screams to stunned silence. Alpha Squadron regrouped on the edge of the battle, their pilots speechless. Not a single civilian ship had been lost. Not one. Evelyn's voice came over the open channel, steady, almost casual. "Control, this is Cross. Situation contained. Returning to base." The reply was ice. Commander Ralvek's voice cut through, colder than the void. "Cross, you are under arrest." Evelyn smirked as she angled her ship back toward Polaris 7. "Copy that, Commander. Looking forward to it." As the 4 fighters cut across the stars in formation, Evelyn caught fragments of chatter spilling across frequencies she shouldn't have been able to access. Other stations, other pilots, questions, disbelief, awe. How had 4 ships accomplished what a squadron couldn't? Who were they? What kind of training were they receiving? And then, one transmission slipped through the static. A voice, calm, deliberate, carrying the weight of something larger. "Cadet Cross, this is Phoenix. We've been waiting for you." A mini twist settled like a spark in Evelyn's chest. Whoever Phoenix was, they knew her name. They knew the slip. And they weren't pirates. The revolution she never meant to start was already spreading. The tribunal convened in Polaris 7's cavernous hangar, a space more suited for starships than politics. Now, rows of officers and soldiers crowded the steel floor while massive council banners unfurled from the rafters. Docked above them, 12. Council warships hung in orbit like executioners' blades, their presence a reminder that this wasn't a hearing. It was a warning. Admiral Sarath stood at the center of a curved table, his voice carrying the weight of judgment across the hangar. "Cadet Evelyn Cross," he intoned, every syllable sharp. "You stand accused of treason, insubordination, and the systematic undermining of council doctrine. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Evelyn faced him with her hands clasped. Behind her back, her boots planted firm. The echo of pirate wreckage still rang in her memory, the feel of the slip still alive in her blood. "I do," she said, her voice calm. "How many of your pilots came home alive last month?" A murmur rippled through the hall. Sarath's ridged brow furrowed. "Irrelevant." Evelyn's eyes burned with defiance. "Because mine all did." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, full of things unspoken. Then from the side of the crowd, Captain Zareth stepped forward, towering and scared, his voice like a drum. "Admiral, permission to speak." "Denied," Sarath snapped. "I wasn't asking," Zareth growled. He faced the assembly, mandibles clicking. 17 years of service. I have watched good soldiers die following your doctrine. Evelyn Cross showed me another way. Another figure stepped forward. Marcus Hale, his cybernetic arm still smoking from battle repairs. He raised it high, his grin lopsided but fierce. "Lieutenant Marcus Hale. Since applying Cross's methods, my squadron's survival rate improved. 63%. That's not insubordination. That's survival." One by one, others emerged from the crowd. A human officer with weathered eyes. A Thessari pilot decorated with honors. Even Commander Ralvek, stiff as iron, broke ranks to stand beside them. 14 successful operations, he said, voice tight but unwavering. 0 casualties, all under Cross's guidance. The hangar buzzed like a live wire. The tribunal's carefully staged theater was slipping out of their control. Sarath barked orders, but the tide had already shifted, and then came the voice that froze the chamber. Old, resonant, carrying the authority of legend. "Admiral Sarath, you'll want to see this." All eyes turned as Admiral Carter, the hero of the Altair campaign, stepped through the crowd holding a datapad. Age had bent his back, but not his resolve. He tapped the pad, and a holographic display burst to life above the hangar. Statistics, charts, and hard numbers cascading in the air. "I've reviewed tactical data from every engagement involving Cross's protocols," Carter said. "Mission success rates up 40%. Casualty rates down across the board. Most compelling of all, not a single pilot using the slip has been killed in the last 6 months. Not one." Gasps rippled like shockwaves. Even Surath faltered, his hands tightening on the table. Before he could recover, another presence cut into the silence. A woman stepped from the shadows at the edge of the hangar, tall, pale, dressed in a uniform with no insignia. Only a small pin gleamed on her chest, a bird rising from flames. Her eyes locked on Evelyn's with unsettling calm. "I am Colonel Nira," she said, "leader of the Phoenix Circle." The crowd stirred. The name carried whispers of rebellion, of pilots who broke rules and survived battles they shouldn't have. Nira's gaze swept the tribunal. "The Council already knows. They've been watching Evelyn Cross since the rift. They knew the slip, spread through the ranks. They let her be condemned to draw us out." "Well, Admiral, here we are." Many twists struck like thunder. Evelyn's breath caught. She wasn't the spark. She was the bait. Surath's face flushed with fury. "This is treason. You undermine the very foundation of—" "No," Carter interrupted, his voice like steel. "This is evolution." The tribunal dissolved into chaos. Officers shouting, soldiers stepping forward to declare their survival ode to Cross, council aides scrambling for control. Above it all, Evelyn stood motionless, the storm swirling around her. She should have felt vindicated. Instead, she felt the weight of something far heavier. Surath raised his hand at last, voice trembling with suppressed rage. "Cadet Cross, you will remain at rank. You will remain here, confined to Polaris 7. But effective immediately, you will instruct select personnel in your methods. Officially, punishment. Unofficially." His mouth curled bitterly. "You have been made the most dangerous teacher in the galaxy." Evelyn's jaw tightened, but she nodded once. "On one condition. The network stays underground. No investigations. No purges." Surath's eyes burned, but Carter's approving smile carried the moment. "Agreed." As the tribunal fractured, officers dispersing in murmurs, new ships began arriving at Polaris 7, small, battered, carrying the Council's problem cases. Pilots too reckless, too difficult, too brilliant. Evelyn watched them dock one by one, a quiet revolution assembling beneath the Council's nose. Colonel Nira stepped close, her voice low. Her words meant only for Evelyn. "You bent the stars, Cross. That was the beginning." Evelyn met her gaze, unflinching. "What's next?" Nira's smile was thin, dangerous. "Next, we break them." The hangar lights flickered, the hum of the station deepening as if the galaxy itself was holding its breath. And somewhere in the void, the future had already shifted.